You, she said slowly, are going to project "Beware of muffins" onto the actual moon. Because Brenda Baxter fined you $50? And threatened legal action, I corrected. It's about freedom of expression and hilarious overkill. They demanded I take the sign down. They never specified it couldn't go up. Way, way up. She just sighed that sigh again, but this time I thought I saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes. Okay, Q, just try not to accidentally signal any aliens, all right? Or start an interplanetary war over baked goods. All right, let's get this straight. I'm not an unreasonable guy. I pay my taxes, I recycle aggressively, I even bring muffins to the neighborhood potluck, when I remember it's happening. But when the Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association decided my little front yard sign was tearing apart the very fabric of suburban decency, well, lines were crossed. And when lines are crossed, sometimes you have to redraw them, in 50-foot-high letters, on the moon. It started, as most suburban skirmishes do, innocently enough. I'd been tinkering in the lab, my glorified garage packed with enough oscilloscopes, circuit boards, and salvaged server racks to make a Bond villain jealous, working on a little atmospheric resonance project. Don't ask. Anyway, I felt a public service announcement was in order. So I had a sign professionally made. Nice, sturdy aluminum, clean font, looked quite smart, really. I planted it firmly in the mulch bed near the sidewalk. There, I announced, stepping back to admire it. Perfect spot. High visibility for potential temporal tourists, or, anyone craving baked goods. Maria, my infinitely patient partner, observed from the kitchen window, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She slid the window open. Alex, are you sure about this sign? Warning. Temporal distortions reported in vicinity. Proceed with caution and muffins. It's a little out there, even for you. Nonsense, I declared, adjusting it a fraction of an inch. It's vital public information. If someone accidentally slips into last Tuesday, don't you think they'd appreciate a heads up? And perhaps a muffin? It's whimsy, Maria. Community enrichment through calibrated absurdity. She just sighed, a sound I've come to recognize as the universal signal for Alex is doing that thing again. Just try not to antagonize Brenda Baxter before lunchtime, okay? Too late. Like a beige-clad, heat-seeking missile honing in on anything remotely interesting, Brenda materialized at the edge of my lawn. Clipboard ready. Permafrown engaged. Brenda Baxter, HOA president, guardian of suburban monotony, and a woman whose idea of radical self-expression was choosing eggshell over off-white for her trim. Alex. Her voice could curdle milk at 50 paces. A word. Brenda, I beamed, adopting my most harmless eccentric persona. Good morning. Just doing a spot of civic improvement. Admiring my new safety advisory. Her eyes, narrowed into suspicious slits, scanned the sign as if it contained coded alien threats. Safety advisory? She sniffed. The Architectural Review Committee received no submission for this installation. She tapped the aluminum with a perfectly manicured finger. And the content? Temporal distortions? She said the words like they were contagious. Can't be too careful, Brenda, I chirped. Potential paradoxes, causality loops, nasty business. Thought it best to warn folks. Besides, the bylaws regarding public safety postings are quite clear. I was bluffing, naturally. The bylaws probably only covered wet paint signs. The bylaws, she interrupted, her voice dangerously smooth, state that all signs must be pre-approved by the committee. They must adhere to strict size and content guidelines, typically limited to for sale, garage sale. This Saturday, or beware of dog. Not? She waved vaguely at my sign. This. She made some cryptic marks on her clipboard, a gesture that always preceded trouble. "Expect a formal follow-up, Alex?" She turned and marched away, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path with grim determination. The formal follow-up arrived 3 days later. Official HOA letterhead, laser-printed precision, subject, violation notice number 1, unapproved signage, Bylaw 12, subsection D, paragraph 2. I read it aloud to Maria over breakfast, savoring the bureaucratic poetry. Sign installation completed without prior written consent from the Architectural Review Committee. Size exceeds maximum allowable dimensions by approximately 47 square inches. Content deemed inconsistent with prevailing community aesthetic standards and potentially confusing or alarming to residents. Alarming? It mentions muffins, for crying out loud. The letter demanded immediate removal within 7 days, or the fining process would commence. $50 per day. "Maybe just take it down, Alex," Maria suggested, pouring more coffee. "Is a sign about time travel and baked goods really the hill you want to die on?" "It's the principle, Maria," I insisted, though principle was rapidly becoming intertwined with sheer, unadulterated stubbornness. "It's my yard. And who decides the prevailing community aesthetic standard? Brenda and her beige paint chips. Besides," I lowered my voice dramatically, "what if the temporal distortions are real?" She just gave me that look again. Okay, maybe the distortions weren't strictly real yet, but the HOA's overreach definitely was. I wasn't taking it down. Instead, I crafted a response. A masterpiece of polite deflection and weaponized technobabble. I argued the sign wasn't signage in the traditional sense, but rather a passive environmental monitoring marker. I cited non-existent atmospheric phenomena it was supposedly tracking. I suggested its removal might violate obscure and fictional FCC regulations regarding public safety broadcasts. I even attached a poorly photoshopped picture of a squirrel looking confused near the sign as anecdotal evidence of its necessity. They were not amused. The fines started arriving like clockwork. Nasty little reminders tucked in with the bills. Then came the certified letters, requiring a signature, each escalating the threats. Failure to comply. Final notice. Intent to place a lien. I tried malicious compliance. I took down the original sign. Then, under cover of darkness, I installed a new one, exactly meeting the ridiculously tiny 6x8-inch size requirement specified in the bylaws. But I made it out of high-intensity reflective material, angled it just so it caught every passing headlight, and used a font that was technically legible, but resembled angry spaghetti. And just for kicks, I added a tiny, solar-powered, intermittently blinking red LED in the corner. The text now read, "Tani TMP Distertens Arpart, Babiyabauer MFNs." Brenda was at my door less than 12 hours later. "Alex, the blinking. Bylaw 15. Section F clearly prohibits flashing or intermittent illumination, and that font is deliberately obstructive. This is mockery." "Just trying to comply within the established parameters, Brenda," I said innocently. "Maximizing visibility for safety, you understand." That earned me another violation notice, nuisance illumination, and double the daily fines. The final straw wasn't a notice. It was a thick, creamy envelope delivered by courier. From Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, the notoriously humorless law firm the HOA kept on retainer. Inside, dense paragraphs of impenetrable legalese boiled down to one simple message. Take down the sign. Any sign related to temporal distortions or muffins, apparently, permanently within 10 days, or they would sue me into the middle of next week, seeking injunctions, legal fees, punitive damages, and possibly my firstborn child. I stared at the letter. the sheer weight of its pretentious letterhead pressing down on me. They were actually threatening to sue me over a quirky sign. Because Brenda Baxter, Queen of Beige, High Priestess of Conformity, had decreed it must be so. My friend Dave, the guy who cemented his patio chair, we bonded over HOA horror stories, was over for beers later. I showed him the letter. "Whoa," he said, eyes wide. "Lawyers? Seriously? Dude, just take the sign down. It's not worth getting sued over." I didn't say anything. I just stared out the window, past my meticulously neat lawn, gotta keep some things compliant, towards the darkening sky. Take the sign down. Yes. The physical sign. The one on my lawn. The lawyers were very specific about the lawn sign, but they didn't say anything about other locations. My gaze drifted upwards. The moon was rising, a pale crescent hanging in the twilight. An idea started to form. A crazy, impossible, monumentally stupid, absolutely perfect idea. "They control the lawn," I murmured, almost to myself. "They dictate the fence height, the shrubbery placement, the exact shade of taupe my mailbox is allowed to be." My eyes fixed on the moon. "But they can't control that, can they?" Dave followed my gaze. "Control the moon? What are you talking about?" A slow grin spread across my face. "They want the sign down, Dave?" "Fine. I'll take it down." I turned back to him, my eyes probably gleaming with a touch of madness. "But I'm putting it back up somewhere Brenda's clipboard can't quite reach." Later that night, after Dave left, shaking his head and muttering something about needing stronger friends, I retreated to the lab, pushed aside the atmospheric resonator components, pulled up schematics for large-scale laser optics, started running calculations. High-energy pulsed laser check. Had a decommissioned industrial cutting laser in storage that might work with significant modification. Adaptive optics system to compensate for atmospheric distortion. Tricky but doable. The principles were similar to astronomical telescope tech. Lunar ephemeris, tracking software. Complex, but I could write that. Power requirements. Okay, that was going to be an issue. I'd probably need to bypass the main house circuit and tap directly into the substation feed. Might need a very long extension cord. I sketched frantically on a whiteboard. Laser beam expander, collimator, fast steering mirror, deformable mirror, projection lens. Assembly, the atmosphere. The freaking moon. It was insane. Utterly, magnificently insane. The cost would be astronomical. The technical challenges bordered on impossible. It was, objectively, the stupidest, most disproportionate response to an HOA dispute in human history. I had to do it. Maria found me hunched over the whiteboard at 3 a.m., surrounded by equations and empty coffee cups. "Alex? What is this? It looks like the Death Star plans." "Better," I declared, spinning around, energized despite the hour. "It's Operation Lunar Billboard." I excitedly explained the concept bypassing the HOA's terrestrial jurisdiction entirely by taking the sign interstellar. Or at least cislunar. She stared at me, then at the whiteboard, then back at me. "You," she said slowly, "are going to project Beware of Muffins onto the actual moon. Because Brenda Baxter fined you $50? And threatened legal action," I corrected. "It's about freedom of expression and hilarious overkill. They demanded I take the sign down. They never specified it couldn't go up. Way, way up." She just sighed that sigh again, but this time I thought I saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "Okay, Q, just try not to accidentally signal any aliens, all right? Or start an interplanetary war over baked goods." The next few months were a blur of focused obsession. Sourcing the components was an adventure in itself. You can't just order a moon-grade laser projection system on Amazon Prime. I had to call in favors from old university colleagues, navigate the labyrinthine world of surplus scientific equipment auctions, and explain to bewildered suppliers why I needed things like a Kerr cell Q switch rated for gigawatts or a cryogenically cooled CCD sensor array. Yes, a 5-kilowatt continuous wave ytterbium fiber laser, I'd say smoothly into the phone, trying to sound nonchalant. Beam quality factor preferably less than 1.2. Yes, the adaptive optics mirror needs at least 512 actuators. Cooling? Oh, just spec me a closed-loop liquid nitrogen system capable of dissipating, let's call it a significant thermal load. Billing? Absolutely. Send the invoice to Temporal Muffin Research Institute. Large crates began arriving, requiring forklifts and hushed deliveries in unmarked vans. My electricity bill quadrupled. The garage lab became my command center. Wires snaked everywhere. Cooling fans whined constantly. The air hummed with latent power. Aligning the optics was a nightmare, requiring nanometer precision. Writing the tracking software involved complex orbital mechanics and real-time atmospheric modeling that made my head hurt. I barely slept. I lived on coffee and, ironically, muffins. Maria became adept at navigating the obstacle course of laser components and power conduits to leave sustenance rations. "Find any temporal distortions yet?" she'd ask dryly. "Just the one where Tuesday seems to have disappeared," I'd grumble, tightening a waveguide coupler. There were near disasters. During a low-power systems check, I misaligned the primary collimator and accidentally vaporized Brenda's prize-winning garden gnome across the street. Oops. Replaced it anonymously via overnight delivery. Another time, I overloaded a capacitor bank and plunged the entire block into darkness for 3 hours, forcing me to feign ignorance when the emergency utility crew arrived. The biggest scare came during the first atmospheric compensation test. I needed a target. Aiming for the moon directly felt premature. I targeted a high, wispy cirrus cloud bank instead, projecting a simple test pattern. Just a grid. Unfortunately, I hadn't accounted for wind shear at altitude or the flight path of Delta 1492 from Dallas to Seattle. For about 3 terrifying seconds, the passengers on the port side were treated to the sight of a giant, shimmering hashtag projected onto their wing. I slammed the emergency shutdown button, my heart pounding. The subsequent FAA query about unexplained aerial illumination phenomena required some very creative explanations involving migratory geese and swamp gas. Lesson learned. Precision and secrecy were paramount. Finally, after months of work, ludicrous expense, and several near misses with federal agencies, it was ready. A gleaming, complex monstrosity of lasers, mirrors, and cooling pipes filled half the garage, aimed through a retractable slit I'd secretly installed in the roof. The power conduits bypassed the house entirely, running underground to a discreet and highly illegal tap into the main neighborhood power trunk line. Tonight was the night. Conditions were perfect. Clear, crisp autumn air, minimal atmospheric turbulence, and most importantly, a glorious, full harvest moon hanging high and bright in the velvet sky. I sat at the console, Maria hovering nervously behind me. On the main screen, the lunar surface swam into sharp focus, the adaptive optics compensating beautifully for the atmospheric shimmer. Subsidiary screens showed power levels, cooling status, laser stability, tracking accuracy. It felt like a NASA mission control, albeit one dedicated to galactic-level pettiness. "Tracking locked," I murmured, my fingers flying over the keyboard. Optics compensated, cooling system nominal, power capacitors charged to 95%. I took a deep breath. Initiating projection sequence. I hit the big red button labeled, perhaps inevitably, Muffins, The lab filled with a deep hum. Outside, a low thrumming sound vibrated through the ground as the massive power draw kicked in. The cooling systems roared to life. Through the roof slit, an impossibly bright, tightly focused beam of light stabbed silently upwards towards the heavens. On the monitor, the image was stable. I toggled the projection feed live. Outside, the usual suburban quiet reigned. A few neighbors walked their dogs. Old Man Hemmings was fiddling with his telescope on his driveway. Then someone pointed. A gasp. Another point. Phones started appearing. Slowly, faintly at first, words began to resolve on the bright face of the moon. Shimmering slightly, like heat haze, but undeniably there. Warning. Temporal distortions reported in vicinity. Proceed with caution. And muffins. It hung there, superimposed on the sea of tranquility. My absurd little sign, writ large across the heavens. Confusion rippled through the neighborhood. "Is that words?" someone asked incredulously. "On the moon? What the heck does it say? Something about muffins?" Then, inevitably, Brenda Baxter's porch light flicked on. She emerged in her bathrobe, drawn by the commotion. She looked around, annoyed, then followed the pointing fingers upwards. Her jaw didn't just drop. It unhinged. Her eyes bulged. Her face cycled through disbelief, confusion, sputtering rage, and finally, a kind of stunned, horrified awe. She just stood there, bathrobe flapping slightly in the breeze, pointing a trembling finger at the moon, utterly speechless. I watched her from the lab window, a grin spreading across my face. "Checkmate, Brenda. Check. Mate." I let the projection run for a full hour, long enough for half the neighborhood to take blurry photos, long enough for bewildered calls to flood the local news station and police department, long enough for Brenda to cycle through several more shades of apoplexy, before initiating the shutdown sequence. The beam vanished. The hum died down. The moon returned to its silent, unadulterated state. The aftermath was glorious chaos. The local news ran a confused segment about the mysterious lunar message, featuring shaky phone footage and bewildered man-on-the-street interviews. Theories ranged from aliens to viral marketing for a new bakery. Brenda, recovering her voice, went on a rampage. She called the police, demanding they arrest me for, well, she wasn't sure what, but definitely something involving the moon. The dispatcher, after a long pause, reportedly asked if she'd been drinking and suggested she call back in the morning. She called the FAA, insisting I must have violated flight path regulations. Of the moon? They politely informed her their jurisdiction ended somewhere below the Kármán line. She tried contacting NASA. I can only imagine that conversation. "Yes, hello, NASA. My neighbor. He wrote, on the moon, something about muffins." Click. The HOA held an emergency meeting. Brenda, apparently now communicating primarily through frantic gestures and strangled noises, tried to explain what had happened. The board members stared blankly. "How do you write a violation notice for unauthorized lunar projection? What fine do you levy? Does Bylaw 12 even apply in low Earth orbit?" Their entire system of petty tyranny was rendered utterly impotent by the sheer scale of the absurdity. They never sent me another letter. The fines stopped. The legal threats vanished. Brenda Baxter, broken by forces beyond her comprehension, and possibly fearing I might project her tax returns onto Jupiter next, resigned as HOA president and put her house up for sale remarkably quickly, citing a sudden desire to move somewhere with less astronomical interference. The physical sign stayed down, of course. I had technically complied with their original demand. But everyone knew. Everyone knew who had taken their silly suburban squabble and gone supernova with it. I became a local legend. The guy who told the HOA to go moon themselves, and actually did it. It's quieter now. The new HOA president gives me a wide berth. Life is peaceful. Sometimes, on clear nights, I go out to my observatory, the lab cleaned up nicely, point my telescope towards the moon, and just look. Maria joins me sometimes. "Think you'll ever fire up the muffin ray again?" she asked one night, leaning against the telescope mount. "Nah," I said, smiling faintly as I focused on the sea of tranquility. It looked perfectly normal. Pristine. Think the message was received. I took a sip from my mug. Printed on the side, a familiar warning. Temporal distortions reported. Proceed with caution and muffins. Though, I added thoughtfully, gazing at the vastness overhead, Mars is looking particularly bright tonight.